Good evening. I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Tuesday, November 1st. As tensions rise between the Ontario government and CUPE, the Prime Minister is joining others in criticizing the province's use of the Notwithstanding clause. Now, this is in legislation to impose contracts on education workers and ban them from striking. Mr. Trudeau says using the clause to, quote, suspend workers' rights is wrong. And while collective bargaining is difficult, the process must happen. Ontario's legislature is debating the bill today, which comes after the Canadian Union of Public Employees said its 55,000 education worker members would start a full strike on Friday. CUPE says it will stage a walkout on Friday despite the legislation, and it's not clear whether that walkout would be for more than one day. All right, well, meanwhile, Freedom Convoy organizers are now testifying at the public inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. Chris Barber, one of the co-founders of the protest, says he was contacted by a fellow truck driver. This was about organizing some kind of demonstration against vaccine mandates for truck drivers who cross the border. Mr. Barber says after that, the organization came together organically and quickly through social media. Several of the protest organizers, including Mr. Barber, Tamara Litch, and Pat King, are facing criminal charges related to their involvement. The Canadian government has announced plans to drastically boost immigration heading into 2025. The federal government is setting a goal of welcoming 500,000 newcomers each year. Immigration Minister Sean Fraser revealed the new targets today. He says the move is necessary to ensure Canada's economic prosperity. The new plan puts an emphasis on increasing the number of immigrants who will be admitted based on their work skills or experience. This comes with about 1 million job vacancies across the country. All right, turning to a new Equifax survey, which has revealed that the average Canadian credit card balance hit a record high at the end of September. Equifax Canada's latest consumer survey finds the average credit card balance was $2,121, and that more than half of Canadians surveyed have a lot of anxiety about their personal debt levels. The average non-mortgage debt for Canadians ranged close to $21,188. More than half of respondents said they are looking for deals at the grocery store more than last year or cutting back on grocery shopping altogether. All right, well, on the West Coast, BC's Teachers Union says a proposed new 3-year contract puts public educators in the top tier of pay in Canada. BC Teachers Federation President Clint Johnson spoke on the tentative deal reached with the provincial government. He says under the deal, pay for teachers at the top of the salary grid will rise to an extra $13,500 a year by the final year. He says that puts them much closer to or even above teachers in places like Calgary and Toronto. The deal also offers more prep time for elementary teachers and improvements to health and maternity benefits. The Toronto Stock Exchange reopened this morning after a technical issue halted trading shortly after the opening bell. The technical issue stopped trading on the TSX, the TSXV, and Alpha markets just after 10 a.m. The group operating the markets was previously hit with an outage in February 2020. This is due to a system capacity issue amid heavy trading during the early days of the pandemic. The federal government is asking for help in identifying the remains found in unmarked graves on the grounds of residential schools across the country. The International Commission on Missing Persons confirms that it has been approached for help. Headquartered in The Hague, the organization works in different countries. It helps to identify people who have gone missing or been killed in major conflicts and disasters using DNA testing. At least 9 First Nations across Canada have reported discovering over 1,600 possible graves of Indigenous children who were forced to attend residential schools. The mother of Canada's last soldier fatality in Afghanistan has been chosen to lay a wreath on Remembrance Day by the Royal Canadian Legion. Candy Greff is this year's Silver Cross mother, and she will lay a wreath at the National War Memorial on behalf of all mothers who have lost children in service to Canada. Ms. Greff's son, Master Corporal Byron Greff, was working as a military trainer when he was killed by a suicide bomber in October of 2011. Canada's mission in Afghanistan ended in 2014. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break. And when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at the ongoing protests in Iran and what Canada is doing about them. We're going to speak with Ms. Shadi Sadr, the Executive Director of Justice for Iran. She's going to unpack what the latest sanctions mean for the crackdown on protesters amid the biggest uprising since the Islamic Revolution. So stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. Stay tuned. Foreign Affairs Minister Melanie Joly has announced new sanctions against Iran's national police force and an Iranian international university. This is the fourth round of sanctions by Canada against the Iranian regime. The move on Monday comes in response to the Iranian government's continued crackdown on weeks of protests. The sanctions came the same day Iran announced that it would hold public trials for 1,000 people in Tehran over the protests, which began after the September 16th death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in the custody of the country's morality police. Well, joining us now to give us her take on the developing situation is Ms. Shadi Sadr, Executive Director of Justice for Iran. Ms. Sadr, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Now, how are you reacting to Canada's latest sanctions, and how do you expect them to impact the ongoing crackdown on protesters?
Well, in general, more sanctions on perpetrators, whether they are individuals or entities, are welcome. But we yet to see the real impact of those sanctions that can be demonstrated in two things. One is the enforcement of those sanctions. For example, this international university, Mustafa International University, is an international entity. They have assets all over the world. What would really good to see after designating this entity is freezing the assets of this university and having news about real restrictions of the activities of those who are involved in committing gross human rights violations. And second thing is to extend the sanctions to the individuals, to the relatives of those who are perpetrators of gross human rights violations. So we know that some of the perpetrators that are already in the list of sanctions by Canada or EU or US have relatives in Canada, and these individuals have benefited from the human rights violations in Iran, either financially or other kind of privileges. So until and unless we see the real impact and enforcement of the sanctions, we cannot be very positive about designating human rights violators, because in order to just saying that these sanctions are effective, we need to see them being enforced properly and effectively.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, a lot still needs to be done, Ms. Sadr. Now, we mentioned 1,000 people are being brought to public trial for their involvement in these protests. How do you expect these public trials to unfold?
From what we know from previous experiences, there would be show trials. The detainees wouldn't have access to the lawyers, and they are, as we speak, they are under duress and pressure and torture, severe torture, to confess against themselves and the other detainees, and also to repeat the narratives of the governments that these protests are led by the US or Israel or Saudi Arabia or European countries' agents. So this is what we would see in near future in the show trials. So the detainees would come to the stage one by one, and under duress, they would actually repeat those forced confessions.
All right, Ms. Sadr, just about a minute left here, but considering this is being called the biggest uprising since the Islamic Revolution, do you see an end in sight for these protests?
One thing that I can say certainly is that this is the beginning of the end. The protesters, despite the intensifying pressure and crackdown, they are still in the streets, and they are determined to overthrow the regime once and for all.
All right, Ms. Sadr, it looks like a quick 20 seconds left here. But for our Canadian viewers, what can they do to get involved?
I think everything that prevent this regime from continuing the bloodshed would be effective. So we need actions that really damage the Islamic Republic regime, actions such as expelling the ambassadors or like diplomats of this regime from different countries, actions such as removing the Islamic Republic teams from sport competitions, from cultural events, any actions that actually recognize the fact that this regime is no longer representing its people, because a regime cannot represent the people and killing them at the same time.
Canada's largest school board says it will close schools on Friday in response to a planned walkout by Ontario education workers. The Toronto District School Board says it has no option but to suspend in-person learning. This comes as educational support staff protest legislation that imposes a contract and bans a strike. On Monday, the Ontario government introduced legislation to squash Friday's planned strike, but the move is getting a lot of criticism from education workers, legal experts, and most recently, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this morning. Well, joining us now to discuss the situation is Dr. Joseph Rose, a collective bargaining and dispute resolution specialist and professor emeritus at McMaster University. Dr. Rose, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
So for our national viewers who may not be familiar with the situation in Ontario, can you briefly unpack this dispute for us?
Well, it's pretty complicated, but basically it's simple as well. I mean, you have a situation in which education sector workers have been subject to a 1% freeze for 3 years. And now the back to work legislation says we're going to give you 4 more at a rate much lower than what the union is seeking.
Now, the real sticking point here, a lot of attention is being brought to this notwithstanding clause. We just heard from the Prime Minister this morning criticizing it. So what are your thoughts on this notwithstanding clause?
It's terrible in simple terms. It doesn't make any sense other than allowing the government to do whatever it wants to do. We already know that the wage freeze dispute for 3 years is subject to a charter challenge. So they want to head that off. Basically, they want their meal and they want to eat it too. I mean, it's problematic in the sense that it closes a lot of doors to not only this group, but the teachers who are waiting in the wings.
And on that note, how do you expect this move to impact future labor relations with the province?
Well, it's tricky. Arguably, it will have a chilling effect on other public sector workers. The threat is there. On the other hand, a lot of things can happen this week. We don't know what's going to happen on Friday. The bill hasn't been passed yet, as far as I know. And so I think a lot of people will be sharpening their pencils and trying to figure out what to do.
Lots to keep our eyes on this upcoming Friday. Now, what other choices would CUPE have left if this notwithstanding clause is implemented, both legally and politically?
I think the simple answer is they'll have to huddle with their lawyers and figure this out. This is really a legal problem. It's also a political problem, but it's compounded by the fact that this government has a majority and was recently reelected.
All right, and taking a more broader perspective on this, historically, how have these previous labor disputes involving the notwithstanding clause unfolded?
Well, it's rare. I think I've read in the Globe Mail there's only been one other case, so this is quite unique and to most experts quite offensive.
And what would be your recommendations in terms of handling this dispute from the perspective of both sides here?
Well, I'm a advocate of free collective bargaining. I mean, the reason we have strikes and lockouts, which is quite infrequent, is it forces the parties to reassess their positions and assess what are the costs associated with the work stoppage relative to the cost of a new collective agreement in those terms. On the other hand, if you go down the road of back to work legislation, in my judgment, it should be interest arbitration. You can appoint a mediator arbitrator to resolve this dispute. Arbitrators will decide the case based on objective criteria. The terms set out in this legislation beg the question of whether they're anything but highly subjective, even arbitrary.
And is there anything that you are keeping your eyes on as this dispute unfolds, Doctor?
Well, I'm looking forward to Friday because it's sort of a black box at the moment. But I would think that, even if this legislation sticks and there's not much you can do with it, it's going to create a whole bunch of problems, not only in the public sector, but more generally in collective bargaining.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Rose, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at major news stories and headlines from around the world as authorities in South Korea admit responsibility in a deadly crowd surge that left over 150 people dead. And UN experts inspect 2 sites in Ukraine that Russia identified in its dirty bomb allegations. These stories and more up next. South Korea's police chief has admitted a heavy responsibility for failing to prevent Saturday night's crowd surge. It killed at least 156 people and injured some 150 others during Halloween festivities in Seoul. The chief said on Tuesday that officers didn't effectively handle earlier emergency calls about the unfolding disaster in the popular Itaewon district. Moving to India now, where the Prime Minister has visited the site of a recently repaired 143-year-old suspension bridge that collapsed into a river. Sunday night's collapse sent hundreds plunging into the water. It killed at least 135 people. Narendra Modi later went to Morbi town in his home state of Gujarat. This is where he visited the injured at a hospital on Tuesday. All right, well, meanwhile, experts from the United Nations Nuclear Power Agency have inspected 2 sites in Ukraine that Russia identified in its unfounded dirty bomb allegations. The Russians claim that Ukrainian authorities were manufacturing radioactive dirty bombs to be used as a provocation in the war. The International Atomic Energy Agency Director General says inspections will be completed soon. This comes as officials look for evidence of any dirty bomb manufacturing. The agency says they inspected one of the 2 locations a month ago, and no undeclared nuclear activities or materials were found. Well, despite facing the potential threat of being fired upon and sunk into the Black Sea, ships loaded with grain have sailed from Ukraine. Russia suspended its participation in a UN-brokered deal that ensured safe wartime passage of critical food supplies, which are meant for parts of the world that are struggling with hunger. The UN says 3 ships left through a humanitarian sea corridor set up in July. They're carrying over 84,000 metric tons of corn, wheat, and sunflower meal. All right, turning to the United Kingdom, where the Interior Minister is facing criticism for describing migrants crossing the English Channel in small boats as an invasion. Home Secretary Suella Braverman used the term while defending conditions at a processing center for new arrivals. This is where some 4,000 people have been held in a facility intended for 1,600. Ms. Braverman referred to small boat crossings on Monday as the invasion of the southern coast. 50 mainly Western countries are urging China to fully implement all recommendations in a United Nations report. It accuses the country of serious human rights violations stemming from a crackdown on Uyghurs and other mostly Muslim ethnic groups, which may amount to crimes against humanity. They singled out its call for prompt steps to release all those arbitrarily deprived of their liberty in the far western province of Xinjiang. Canada's UN Ambassador Bob Rae read the statement at a meeting of the General Assembly's Human Rights Committee. He expressed concern at China's failure so far to discuss the report's findings. All right, turning our attention to Israel, where people are voting in national elections that are being held for the 5th time since 2019. They are hoping to break the political deadlock that's paralyzed the country for the past 3.5 years. Stocks on Wall Street gave up early gains and turned lower after an unexpectedly strong report on the U.S. job market. It has raised concerns that the Federal Reserve will need to keep the pressure on inflation with aggressive interest rate hikes. The U.S. Labor Department says job openings rose unexpectedly in September, which suggests that the American labor market is not cooling as fast as the Fed had hoped. The department says American employers posted 10.7 million job vacancies in September. This is up from 10.2 million in August. Economists had expected the number of job openings to drop below 10 million. Billionaire Elon Musk is already floating major changes for Twitter as he begins his first week as owner of the social media platform. One proposal would make some users pay if they want to keep a blue check mark on their profile. Twitter has historically used the mark to verify higher profile accounts, including Elon Musk's. This so that other users know it's really them. Critics have derided the mark as an elite status symbol. Well, looks like Canadian rap superstar Drake has lost one of his Billboard bragging rights. Taylor Swift's Midnights became a perfect 10 yesterday. This makes Miss Swift the first artist to ever claim all top 10 slots of the Billboard Hot 100 chart. Drake had previously held the record with 9 out of the 10 songs, but Miss Swift's new album, her 10th, came out on October 21st in one of the industry's biggest album launches in nearly 7 years. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.